Hello, everyone. My name is Barry Heidowitz. I'm a director here at Extreme Labs. I'll be handing things off to Chris, who will be presenting shortly. Keep an eye out. We'll post links for how and where to access the recording. And otherwise, I'll also post my contact information in the chat. And there's also a QA section for people who jump on the call when it's live. They can ask questions. Otherwise, with that, I'll hand this over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Hi, Barry. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share this with you guys. Domier, thank you as well. So when I joined Microsoft nearly 10 years ago, I came in as a cloud solution architect, and I honestly didn't have a real handle on what Azure was all up, and more specifically, the differences between how you connected to PaaS resources as opposed to this kind of mysterious IaaS private virtual network stuff. Luckily for me, I had a partner who kind of put this up on a whiteboard, and we talked it through, and all these lights kind of lit up for me in my brain about the differences between the way that you connect to the PaaS resources that you deploy in the Azure environment, as well as the way that the different ways that you connect to IaaS resources, primary virtual machines, and those types of things. And so we were provisioning a lot of virtual machines back in that time, and I was a little confused about the difference. What I'm going to show you today is I basically took that a whiteboard conversation. I created a Power BI deck. It's a single page, or actually 2 pages. I'll show it to you, and then I'll just kind of walk you through the conversation that I normally have. So normally when I start teaching a class, I'll take a little poll. I'll ask how many of you use Azure on a weekly basis, and if less than half the course, less than half the learners in the course say that they don't use Azure, I just use this as kind of a very high level introduction to Azure all up, and then we talk about the way that we connect to platform as a service resources, or PaaS resources, as well as infrastructure as a service, or IaaS resources. So I'm just going to run through this. It's a pretty short setup, and so this is going to be a short meeting. I just wanted to share this with you. I'm going to make the PowerPoint file available in the chat window, and I think Extreme may be able to post this for those of you who are watching this on a recording. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen, and this is the magic right here. Not very impressive. I realize I'm not a UI professional, but I do like to use this is a combination of writing on the slide and then just kind of building the slide out using the next step, which I'm also going to pull up. All right, let's get started. So the way I like to introduce people to Azure is a cluster of, it is a set of regions, and there's a couple of links in public links available on the internet, and I'll put these in the chat window as well. The first one is, these are all Microsoft sites. So Azure is a cluster of regions all over the world. They're interconnected with private fiber connectivity. This is a great example of what an Azure region looks like. This is a cluster of data centers, which is a little strange for some of us who come from the enterprise world, where when we think about data centers, we think about data centers need to be 300 to 500 miles away from each other. Azure kind of takes that failover, that emergency failover, up to a whole new level. We've got clusters of data centers, and then there's another cluster of data centers 300 to 500 miles away. And so we use regions for disaster recovery. We use data centers for high availability. So this is an example of a picture of a region, and I'm just going to click on this little Explore Microsoft Data Centers link. This is going to take us to a global view of Azure all up, and I can swing around and kind of push this around and I can go in just a little bit, but you can see that each one of these little blue dots represents a region, which again is a cluster of data centers. You can see some webbing in between. This indicates the fiber connectivity between all of these regions. I can swing back over to Europe, and you can see that Europe, because it's a very crowded landmass of countries, there's a ton of these out here as well. Each one of these blue dots, by the way, is a cluster of data centers. Microsoft owns and operates all of these data centers, except for in China, where it's illegal for a U.S. Based company to own data centers, and so we rent those. So that's my first little spiel about Azure, using just those. Here's what an Azure region looks like. This is what it looks like when you take it to a global level. And so we'll jump back into this slide deck, and I'll kind of build it out for you. So here you are, sitting on-prem or sitting remotely to your office. And you have your, here on this diagram, we've got 3 different areas. And let me just do the build out here. Got the on-prem network, the internet, and the Azure cloud that we just saw, this private cloud. And built into this deck is also on the second page is are some resource icons. Let me just show you that real quick. I'm going to go out of the slide deck, go back to the PowerPoint deck, and you can see here that I've got a bunch of service icons. These are the service icons that I kind of pre-build into this conversation, depending on which class I'm teaching. So if I'm teaching, Azure SQL Database, I'll use a SQL Server. If I'm talking about storage accounts, there's a storage account icon. There's a bunch of different icons you can use. By the way, you can get these. Just look for the search on the internet for Azure service icons, and it'll take you to the Azure architecture reference. And you can use, whatever works for you in your particular class. In this case, I'm going to go back to the slide deck. I'm teaching an Azure SQL Database class. So let me just continue to build this slide out, and then we'll have a conversation. And by the way, there are full notes in my slide deck for having this conversation. You can see I can kind of set up my notes on one side of the display view, the presenter display view, and you can just walk right through it using the notes that are available. So let me just pull this back out. So in Azure, one of the fundamental differences between provisioning resources in the platform as a service environment as opposed to the infrastructure as a service environment is how you gain access to those. How do you connect to those resources? What are the endpoints? What are the setups? How do you get access to those resources in Azure? And so I'm going to use this simple chart to describe the build out. So we've already looked here on this diagram. You've got the on-prem network on the left, the internet in the middle, Azure cloud, which is a private high-speed network here. The on-prem network is protected from the internet and other networks through a firewall. The only access you have into this on-prem network is through a firewall. Azure also has some firewalls built into it by default. The first one is the separation between the platform as a service network and the IaaS private virtual networks. So when you provision a platform as a service resource like an Azure SQL database, these resources by default, you have to provide a globally unique URL, and you access that Azure SQL database using an encrypted connection over the public internet. That globally unique URL is resolved using a tool that's built into Azure. It's a global tool called the Azure Traffic Manager. So I'm just going to scroll down my notes real quick. So the IaaS private virtual network is different. And right here, I'm going to start just creating some drawings here because I like to draw. So the IaaS private virtual network is the realm of what we call VNets and virtual machines. Just like on-prem, you have virtual machines here. Let's say you've got a 3-tier web app on-prem. Probably that is sitting in what's called a VLAN, and that's basically just a let's say you're using the 10 dot IP address range, which is a private address range. It's a reserved for on-prem networks. And so what this is basically just a little subset of the available IP addresses in that. So let's say call this 10.1.0.0, give it a little subnet, 24, that'll give us 256 IP addresses. We've got the exact same thing in the IaaS private virtual network. You've got VNets. Those VNets can be subnetted as well. And then you can put your web servers in a subnet. You can put your application servers in a subnet. You can put your database servers in a subnet. And so one of the unique things about this IaaS private virtual network is by default, there is no connectivity from the public internet. So how do you get connectivity to the VMs that you've provisioned in Azure? There's a couple of ways of doing that. So the first way is to build connectivity between your on-prem network environment and the Azure private network. You can either use a VPN connection. This requires a VPN device on-prem, and that VPN device has a public IP address. And then on the Azure side, you do basically the same thing. You build a VNet. We'll call that VNet HubNet. We'll put a little VPN gateway appliance here in Azure. And this also has a public IP address, and these two connect to each other over the public internet using a tunnel, which is an encryption methodology, right? You can also use something called ExpressRoute. ExpressRoute is different from a VPN in that it has this is a dedicated circuit between your on-prem network and Azure. It's a private circuit. It doesn't go over the public internet. You can think of it as a physical connection between an on-premise network and the Azure cloud. That's number one. The second way that you can get access to these virtual machines is by installing a service called Bastion. Bastion allows you to access these virtual machines. You log into the Azure portal, and you can log into the operating system, whether that's a Windows operating system or a Linux operating system. You can log into the operating system and kind of noodle around inside of these servers. Still don't have access to be able to use them in the public internet. So when you set up these virtual machines inside of a VNet, each one of these get a private IP address that is in the range of the IP addresses that have been provisioned for this VNet. So let's say this one starts with 10.1.1.0, and it goes all the way to 10.1.1.252 or something like that. So each one of these VNets has a private IP address, but you still don't have access to these from the public internet. So how do you get access to these if you don't have a VPN or an ExpressRoute provisioned? Well, what you can do is you can add a public IP address. You can add a public IP address to this virtual machine. That's your web virtual machine, for example. However, that is not a best practice because the internet, as we know, has become a very dangerous place for single servers to be able to ward off people, concerted attacks and those types of things. And so it's a best practice to put a firewall in between that, give the firewall the public IP address, and just use a private IP address redirect for that. So again, you provision PaaS services, you use a globally unique URL, you access that SQL Server database using an encrypted connection over the public internet. There is a firewall between the dynamically allocated PaaS environment and the IaaS private virtual network environment. So let me ask, just propose this. Say we have this 3-tier web app. We've replicated it into the IaaS private virtual network. We've got a database here, but we want to use a PaaS database instead of using a virtual machine with SQL Server installed on it, for example. There are 2 ways to basically poke a hole in this firewall. The first is called a service endpoint. So this requires some setup both at the VNet level. I'll just change my color here, but you've got to enable it at the VNet level as well as the SQL database resource level. In the VNet, you just turn on the ability for this VNet to access SQL servers writ large. On the SQL database side, you can say only the specific subnet can have access to this particular instance of a SQL Server database. However, when you use a service endpoint, you're still basically using the globally unique URL to access that database, and it can also still be available to the public internet. Because we've worked with some very large telco companies that have that own large pieces and portions of the internet, we came up with a more secure version of that, and that is called a private endpoint. What a private endpoint does is it basically removes access to the public internet by default. That's number one. And then it basically gives the Azure database, which is still a PaaS service, it gives it one of these private IP addresses as part of that VNet. And those 2 things basically make this Azure SQL database only available through these connectivity routes, either a VPN or an express route. So this is a really secure way of being able to provision PaaS resources at a private endpoint. It removes, you can have continuous access to the internet as well, but it turns it off by default, which is really the reason that we have this private endpoint option. So you can add a private endpoint to a PaaS resource, and it basically moves the connectivity, the way that you access it, to a private IP address in the IaaS private virtual networks. So anytime in Azure you see, and most of the resources in Azure have this capability built into them today, anytime you want to limit accessibility to only these, organizational managed connections between on-premises networks in the Azure cloud, you can add what's called a private endpoint to a PaaS resource, and it will change the way that you connect to it from its globally unique URL to a private IP address in your IaaS private virtual network. And that's it. That's the whole thing. That's the whole intro to connect the differences between connectivity in the PaaS environment and the IaaS private virtual network environment. Whenever I do talks like this, I like to keep them under 10 minutes, and then I'll open it up for Q&A, which I'll do right now. So I'll pass it back to you. Barry, anybody have any questions about what we're looking at here? Anything in the chat window that I can answer?
Not yet. We'll leave it open. We can wait And is there anything else that you wanted to? I mean, we'll give them a moment to see if there are any questions.
Yeah. I like to hold my breath for 10 seconds and wait. Anybody have
Okay.
any questions or comments about this particular walkthrough? And again, for those of you who came in late, I also use a couple of websites that are Microsoft websites to kind of give people an overhead introduction to what is Azure. When we talk about Azure, what is it? And I come from an infrastructure background, so I kind of like to take a look at it from an infrastructure standpoint. I've got a couple of links here that I'll share with you. Actually, just one link that gives you both access to both. The first one is this one. Let me pop this into the chat window for the people that are here. So Azure is a collection of regions. There's a great picture of a sample region here. We can talk about data centers. You can have a conversation about compliance and data residency and service availability, all from here. You can look at some of the new regions that are coming online. And then there's a little link here, Explore Microsoft Data Centers, that takes us to the global view of Azure. This global view takes a few seconds to load up, but it's a really great way of being able to visualize. When we say the Azure cloud, what does that mean? Well, it means a collection of data centers that make up each of these little blue dots that are regions. And we can spin this thing around the world, and everybody can kind of see the where their particular Azure region may or may not be. You can even kind of zoom in a little bit. You can see there's some webbing in between these regions that represent the private networking that is built into Azure. Microsoft owns and operates these Azure regions, except in China, where we use a company called 21viaNet. And so this is the way I like to introduce Azure to people that are not familiar with what the Azure cloud is. The two things. Then sometimes I'll have a conversation, for example, about the Azure Resource Manager sets of APIs. These are anytime you create a resource, modify a resource, delete a resource, any of those CRUD operations that you do inside of Azure are actually executed by this Azure Resource Manager set of APIs. And so you've got all this hardware and all these regions here, just stuffed full of hardware. It's duplicated all over the world. It has its own private network connectivity between these Azure regions, and you modify resources in the Azure environment using Azure Resource Manager APIs. I can even talk them. I can even, if they're interested, I can walk them through the creation of an ARM template and those types of things. I'm trying to keep it kind of lightweight. And then this slide, I end up going back to this slide quite a bit to talk about, and I'll just wipe it clean, to talk about, let me go back here to this. And then this is like, it's like a 10-click walkthrough to build this slide out, all the way from blank with a PaaS icon that matches your course, and you can kind of walk through the fact that you got firewalls, PaaS services are provisioned using a globally unique URL. The IP address is dynamic. You don't ever have access to it. And the IaaS private virtual networks, and you can build your own, build out if you want to. I kind of like to draw on it. So I draw a little VNet here. You can have a VNet. What is a VNet? It's a collection of IP addresses. It's basically a subset of all the available IP addresses. I'll draw another little VNet here. I'll draw maybe a VPN device here, and we'll talk about connectivity between on-prem networks and the Azure private virtual network that's built that every customer has access to. We can talk a little bit about subnetting this VNet. I can build out some virtual machines. This is my icon, my personal icon for a virtual machine. discuss the fact that each one of these gets a private IP address from the VNet automatically, and then it just kind of rolls through the different ways of connecting to these virtual machines, which I think is pretty interesting. I mean, you can build out a virtual machine in the Azure environment and you don't have access to it. How do you get access to it? Well, you can either create a VPN or an express route. You can use the Bastion service, or you can give this web version of this 3-tier web app a public IP address. We talk about the fact that that's not a good practice, that you want to at least provision a firewall in front of that has the public IP address, because firewalls are better suited to kind of stave off attacks and things like that. And that's it. And then we talk about the way to kind of bridge the gap between IaaS, private virtual networks, and the PaaS environment using two features. Kind of the classic one is called service endpoint, and then private endpoints basically remove connectivity from the public internet. And the only way that you can access this SQL Server database is by using the private IP address in a VNet. That's the whole talk, basically twice.
There's a question somebody in the chat posted. Are there known misconfigurations or vulnerabilities in the VPN or express route that could expose private endpoints to external threats?
Well, Atif, it's a great question. From a misconfiguration standpoint, it's pretty. So there, off the top of my head, there is a list of recommended VPNs. This is a physical device on the on-prem network. If you're using a VPN that's not part of that list, that can cause issues. There's also the fact that you have to basically connect these two together. That's kind of a tricky thing. You really need a network engineer to do it for you correctly. Otherwise, you end up with something called flapping. This is where it makes a connection, and then it drops a connection, and then it makes a connection again, and it drops it. And so you've got really poor connectivity. But this is an encrypted tunnel to the public internet, so it's safe. The express route is even safer in that this is a dedicated circuit between your customer's on-prem network and the Azure network. So it's a physical connection between those two networks. It's a private connection. It's the exact same type of connection. I think it's called an MPLS connection that you would use if you were, for example, leasing space in a remote data center. So there is no outside access to this MPLS circuit, and so it's very secure as well. Great question, though. Anybody else?
No other questions.
All right.
I mean, if that's it, what we can do, I'll just put my contact info in the chat,
Mm-hmm.
and then.
And I'm going to go ahead and attach this this PowerPoint deck for you guys. Let me just make sure I can. It is set to public, so I'm good to go. I'm going to discard this, and then I'll just give you access to this. I'll post this really quickly. Let me do that. I'll post this, and it is called Azure Network Endpoints. It'll take just a second to load up. I'll also include this link here. I think I've already put it in there. Choose the right Azure region for you. This gives you a great example of what an Azure region looks like. We can talk about the infrastructure, all the connectivity, and then this takes you directly to the globe experience, which I think is a great way of being able to kind of show people, just from an infrastructure standpoint, what Azure looks like. Well, thank you all for participating in this. Good luck with all of your deliveries coming up. I hope you could take advantage of this. I hope it was valuable to you. And just let me know what you think. If you want to join me on LinkedIn, you can do so as well. Just put that in there real quick. Check my spelling, which I'm glad I did. There you go. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Barry and Domia, for giving me the opportunity to share this with you guys. It's been a really valuable thing for me to use, especially, again, in just about every Azure course I cover, I end up having this conversation as kind of an introduction to Azure. So hopefully
Excellent.
it's helpful to you guys as well.
It is helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.